The year is 1918. The guns of the Great War, what we now call World War I, have finally fallen silent. But the silence is not one of peace. It is the eerie quiet of a graveyard. Across Europe, a whole generation of young men is gone, lost to the mud and trenches of the Western Front. Cities that once bustled with life are now piles of rubble, their beautiful old buildings scarred by shellfire. Farms that fed millions are now barren wastelands, torn apart by explosions and poisoned by gas. The continent is exhausted, bleeding and deeply in shock. It has seen death on a scale never before imagined, and no one quite knows how to put the pieces back together again. Imagine walking through the streets of a town in northern France or Belgium. You would see families huddled together, trying to rebuild their homes with whatever they can find. You would see soldiers returning, but they are not the same men who left. They are haunted by what they have seen, their eyes telling stories of unimaginable horror. Many are missing limbs, their bodies forever marked by the conflict. The joy of victory for countries like Britain and France is mixed with a profound sense of loss. They won the war, but the cost was staggering. They are determined that such a catastrophe must never, ever happen again, a feeling that will shape their every decision in the years to come. In the defeated nations, especially Germany, the situation is even more desperate. The people are starving. A blockade by the Allied powers during the war cut off food supplies, and the effects are still being felt. Children are malnourished, and families are struggling to find a single loaf of bread. There is a deep sense of humiliation and confusion. The German people had been told they were winning the war right up until the very end. The sudden surrender feels like a betrayal, a stab in the back by their own leaders. This dangerous idea begins to take root, a poisonous seed planted in the soil of their defeat and suffering. The old world is gone. The great empires that had dominated Europe for centuries, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the Russian, and the German, have all collapsed. In their place, new countries are being drawn on the map, often with little thought for the people who live there. This creates new tensions and new rivalries. The map of Europe is a jigsaw puzzle that has been thrown into the air, and nobody is sure how the pieces will land. The continent is a powder keg of grief, hunger, and political instability. It is in this fragile, broken world that the seeds of another, even more terrible war will be sown. In 1919, the victorious leaders met in the glittering Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. They came to write a peace treaty, a document they hoped would officially end the Great War and prevent another one. This was the Treaty of Versailles. However, instead of healing the wounds of the conflict, it arguably poured salt into them. The treaty was largely written by the Big Three: David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson of the United States. Each man had a different goal. Clemenceau, whose country had been devastated, wanted to crush Germany so it could never threaten France again. He wanted revenge. The terms of the treaty were incredibly harsh on Germany. First, there was the War Guilt Clause. This was Article 231, and it forced Germany to accept complete and total blame for starting the war. For the German people, who believed they had been fighting a defensive war, this was a national humiliation beyond words. It felt like a deep injustice. Then came the financial punishment. Germany was ordered to pay enormous sums of money called reparations to the Allied countries to cover the costs of the war. The final amount was astronomical, so large that it seemed impossible for a country already in economic ruin to ever pay it back. On top of the guilt and the debt, Germany lost huge amounts of territory. The industrial region of Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. Other areas were given to Poland and Czechoslovakia, creating new countries where many Germans now found themselves living as minorities. Germany's overseas colonies were taken away and given to Britain and France, and its military was dismantled. The German army was limited to just 100,000 men, a tiny force for a country of its size. It was forbidden from having an air force, submarines, or tanks. The Rhineland, a key industrial area bordering France, was to be demilitarized, meaning no German soldiers were allowed there. The German people were horrified and furious. They felt the treaty was a diktat, a dictated peace. They had not been invited to the negotiations. They were simply told to sign it or face an invasion. This sense of being unfairly punished created a deep well of resentment that would poison German politics for the next 20 years. Instead of creating a lasting peace, the Treaty of Versailles became a powerful symbol of German humiliation. It was a constant reminder of their defeat and a source of burning anger. This anger would be exploited by extremist politicians who promised to tear up the treaty and restore Germany's honor. In Germany, the years after the war were a time of chaos and despair. The new government, known as the Weimar Republic, was seen as weak from the very beginning. It was the government that had signed the hated Treaty of Versailles. So many Germans associated it with the national disgrace. The economy was in freefall. To pay its debts and keep the country running, the government simply printed more and more money. This led to hyperinflation. By 1923, money became worthless. People would carry wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Life savings were wiped out overnight. This economic disaster destroyed the trust of the middle class and left millions of people feeling desperate and betrayed. In Britain, the mood was very different, but still troubled. The British had won the war, but they were tired of fighting. The memory of the trenches was a fresh and terrible wound. Everyone knew someone who had been killed or injured. The main feeling among the British public was a strong desire for peace at any cost. They looked at the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles, and many felt it had gone too far. They worried that punishing Germany too severely would only lead to more trouble in the future. British leaders were focused on their vast empire and on rebuilding their own economy. They were reluctant to get involved in Europe's problems again and preferred a policy of keeping their distance. France shared a border with Germany and had suffered terribly during the war. Much of the fighting had happened on French soil. The French were terrified that Germany would one day recover its strength and attack again. Their main goal was security. They wanted to keep Germany as weak as possible for as long as possible. They were the biggest supporters of the harsh terms in the Treaty of Versailles because they saw it as their only protection. When Germany failed to make its reparation payments in 1923, French and Belgian troops marched in and occupied the industrial Ruhr region to take what they were owed in goods. This action only made the Germans angrier and more resentful. So you have these three key nations with completely different feelings and goals. Germany is filled with anger, humiliation, and economic desperation. Britain is war-weary and wants to avoid another conflict at all costs, leading to a policy of appeasement later on. France is driven by a deep-seated fear of its powerful neighbor and insists on keeping Germany down. These conflicting emotions and priorities created a dangerous instability in Europe. There was no common ground, no shared vision for the future. It was a continent divided by fear and resentment, making it vulnerable to anyone who could offer a simple, powerful, and dangerous solution. Into this cauldron of German anger and despair stepped Adolf Hitler. He was an Austrian-born former soldier who, like many, felt betrayed by Germany's surrender and disgusted by the Treaty of Versailles. He was a powerful and mesmerizing speaker. When he stood up in the smoky beer halls of Munich, he spoke with a passion that captivated his audience. He gave them simple answers to their complex problems. He told them that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been stabbed in the back by Jews, communists, and weak politicians. He promised to rip up the Treaty of Versailles, a message that resonated deeply with a humiliated nation. Hitler was the leader of a small right-wing group called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party for short. At first, they were just one of many extremist groups in Germany. But Hitler's message was perfectly timed. He offered the German people scapegoats for their suffering and a vision of a glorious future. He promised to restore Germany's honor, rebuild its mighty army, and create a powerful Third Reich that would last for 1,000 years. He promised to create jobs and put food back on the table. For a nation that had been brought to its knees, these promises were incredibly seductive. He gave them hope where there was none. His rise was not immediate. In 1923, he tried to seize power in Munich in an event called the Beer Hall Putsch, but it failed and he was sent to prison. While there, he wrote his book, Mein Kampf, which laid out his hateful ideology of racial purity and his plans for German expansion. After his release, he decided to win power through legal means, by building up the Nazi Party's support in elections. For a while, during a period of relative economic stability in the mid-1920s, the Nazis remained a fringe party. People were less interested in extreme politics when their lives were improving, but that was about to change dramatically. The Great Depression, which we will discuss more, hit Germany harder than almost any other country. By the early 1930s, millions were unemployed. The government seemed powerless to stop the crisis. People were desperate again, and this time they turned to the political extremes. They lost faith in democracy. Hitler and the Nazis seized their chance. Their rallies became bigger and more spectacular, with thousands of uniformed supporters, dramatic flags, and torchlight parades. It was political theater on a grand scale. In 1933, through a combination of political scheming and popular support, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had gained the power he craved. Once in power, Adolf Hitler did not waste any time. He began to systematically dismantle German democracy and openly defy the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, he announced that Germany was rearming, building up its army, navy, and creating a new air force, the Luftwaffe. This was a direct violation of the treaty. How did the other nations react? Britain and France issued protests, but honestly, they did little else. They were not prepared to go to war over it. Britain even signed a naval agreement with Germany, effectively giving its blessing to the expansion of the German navy. This sent a clear signal to Hitler. He could break the rules without facing serious consequences. A year later, in March 1936, Hitler took an even bigger gamble. He ordered his troops to march into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone on the border with France. This was another blatant breach of the treaty. Hitler himself later admitted that if the French had marched to stop him, he would have had to retreat in humiliation as his army was still weak. But France did not act. The French government was politically divided, and its military leaders overestimated German strength. Britain urged caution, arguing that Germany was only marching into its own back garden. Once again, Hitler had pushed the boundaries and gotten away with it. His confidence grew, and his popularity at home soared. Next, Hitler turned his attention to uniting all German-speaking peoples under his rule. In March 1938, he orchestrated the Anschluss, or union, with Austria. German troops rolled into the country, which was welcomed by many Austrians. Again, Britain and France did nothing more than protest. Later that year, Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large German-speaking population, be handed over to Germany. This created a major international crisis. The Czechs were prepared to fight, and they had a strong army and alliances with France and the Soviet Union. War seemed imminent. This led to the infamous Munich Conference in September 1938. The leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and Germany met to decide the fate of Czechoslovakia. Crucially, the Czechs themselves were not invited, nor were the Soviets. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid war, pursued a policy of appeasement. He believed that by giving Hitler what he wanted, he could satisfy his demands and secure peace for our time. They agreed to give the Sudetenland to Germany. Chamberlain returned to Britain a hero, but he had sacrificed a democratic nation in the hope of peace. Hitler had learned a valuable lesson. The Western democracies were weak and would not fight for their principles. The story of the 1930s cannot be told without understanding the Great Depression. It began with the Wall Street crash in October 1929 in the United States, but it quickly spread like a virus across the globe. The world's economies were connected, and when America's economy collapsed, it dragged everyone else down with it. Banks failed, businesses went bankrupt, and international trade ground to a halt. The result was mass unemployment on a scale never seen before. In cities around the world, long lines of jobless men waiting for food became a common and honestly heartbreaking sight. This economic catastrophe created the perfect environment for political extremism to thrive. Germany was hit particularly hard. Its economic recovery in the 1920s had been built on loans from American banks. When the crash happened, those banks wanted their money back immediately. The German economy, which had been fragile to begin with, completely imploded. By 1932, nearly 1 in 3 Germans was unemployed. People were losing their homes, their savings, and really, their hope. The democratic Weimar government seemed utterly incapable of solving the crisis. As desperation grew, people abandoned the moderate political parties and turned to the radicals who offered simple, drastic solutions: the communists on the left and Hitler's Nazis on the right. The Depression also had a huge impact on the foreign policies of countries like Britain and France. They were so focused on their own severe economic problems, unemployment, poverty, and social unrest, that they had little energy or money to spare for international affairs. Rearming to confront a rising Germany was expensive, and taxpayers were already struggling. This economic pressure reinforced the desire to avoid conflict. It was easier and cheaper to hope for the best and appease aggressors than to spend vast sums on building up armies. The Depression made them inward-looking and less willing to take a stand against Hitler's actions. Furthermore, the economic crisis made countries more selfish. They put up trade barriers to protect their own industries, which only made the global depression worse. International cooperation broke down. In this climate of every nation for itself, aggressive, expansionist countries like Japan and Italy, along with Germany, saw an opportunity. They believed the democratic powers were too weak and distracted by their own economic woes to stop them. The Great Depression didn't just cause economic suffering, it poisoned the international atmosphere, destroyed trust between nations, and created a power vacuum that dictators like Hitler were more than willing to fill. History is not just about dates and treaties, it is about people and their feelings. The road to World War II was paved with powerful emotions that shaped the choices of millions. The most dominant of these was anger. In Germany, the anger was a simmering fire that never went out. It was anger at the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, anger at the economic collapse and the loss of savings, and anger at the perceived weakness of their own government. Adolf Hitler was a master at harnessing this collective rage. He gave it a voice and directed it at his chosen enemies, promising that this anger would be transformed into national strength and revenge. Fear was another driving force, especially in Britain and France. For the French, it was the constant, gnawing fear of another German invasion. This fear paralyzed them, making them cling to defensive strategies and reluctant to take risks, as seen when Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland. In Britain, the fear was of another global war. The memory of World War I was a national trauma. The thought of sending another generation of young men to die was unbearable. This deep-seated fear of war was the root of the policy of appeasement. It was not necessarily cowardice, but a desperate and ultimately flawed attempt to prevent a repeat of the horrors of 1914 to 1918. But there was also hope, and it could be just as dangerous. In Germany, Hitler offered a twisted kind of hope. He promised a return to greatness, a powerful nation, and work for the unemployed. To a people who had known only defeat and despair for over a decade, this was an incredibly powerful message. They clung to this hope, and in doing so, many were willing to overlook the dark side of his ideology, the hatred, the violence, and the loss of freedom. They hoped he would make Germany strong again, and they followed him down a path that led to destruction. Hope can be a force for good, but when born of desperation, it can also blind people to terrible dangers. These three emotions, anger, fear, and hope, were in constant conflict, both within and between nations. The German people's hope for revival clashed with the French fear of invasion. The British fear of another war led them to appease Hitler, which in turn fed his belief that he could act without consequence. The decisions made by leaders were not just cold, calculated strategic moves. They were decisions made by human beings under immense pressure, influenced by the powerful emotions of the people they led. Understanding this emotional landscape is crucial to understanding why events unfolded as they did, leading the world step by step towards the abyss of war. After the Munich Agreement in 1938, it seemed for a moment that war had been avoided. Neville Chamberlain had promised peace for our time, but this peace was built on a lie. Hitler had no intention of stopping with the Sudetenland. He had told Chamberlain he had no more territorial ambitions in Europe, but he was already planning his next move. The policy of appeasement had failed. It had only made Hitler bolder. In March 1939, just 6 months after the Munich conference, Hitler broke his promise. His armies rolled into the rest of Czechoslovakia, taking over the entire country. This was a turning point. For Britain and France, This was the final straw. Hitler's occupation of non-German Prague proved that his goal was not to unite German-speaking peoples, but to dominate Europe. The policy of appeasement was dead. Public opinion in Britain swung dramatically. The people now realized that Hitler could not be trusted and had to be stopped. Chamberlain's government, finally understanding the true nature of the threat, made a dramatic promise. They guaranteed the independence of Poland, which was clearly Hitler's next target. This meant that if Germany attacked Poland, Britain and France would declare war. The line in the sand had finally been drawn. Hitler, however, did not believe them. He thought Britain and France were bluffing again. To secure his eastern front and avoid fighting a war on two fronts as Germany had in World War I, he did something shocking. In August 1939, Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact with its ideological archenemy, the Soviet Union. This agreement, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, stunned the world. Secretly, the two dictators, Hitler and Stalin, had agreed to carve up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe between them. With this pact in his pocket, Hitler felt secure. He was now free to attack Poland without fear of Soviet intervention. The final act began at dawn on September 1, 1939. German forces invaded Poland from the west, using a new and terrifying tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. The invasion was swift and brutal. Britain and France issued an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw your troops from Poland, or a state of war will exist between us. Hitler ignored it. On September 3, 1939, Neville Chamberlain announced to the British people and the world that his country was at war with Germany. France followed soon after. The desperate attempts to keep the peace had failed. The unresolved anger of the First War had given birth to a second, even more devastating conflict. World War II had begun. So why is it so important, all these years later on this day, June 12, 2025, to look back and understand the real reasons why World War II started? It is because the story of the 1930s is a powerful and timeless warning. It shows us how fragile peace can be and how easily nations can slide into conflict. It teaches us that unresolved grievances, like the humiliation felt by Germany after the Treaty of Versailles, can fester and become toxic over time. Ignoring the anger and desperation of a nation does not make the problem go away. It can create a fertile ground for dangerous leaders to rise to power by promising simple solutions and scapegoats. Learning about this period also teaches us critical lessons about international diplomacy. The policy of appeasement shows the dangers of ignoring aggression in the hope that it will simply stop. While the desire for peace is noble, turning a blind eye to a dictator breaking international laws and invading their neighbors can be a catastrophic mistake. It can embolden the aggressor and make a much larger conflict inevitable. The story of the 1930s forces us to ask difficult questions that are still relevant today. When is it right to stand up to a bully? What is the price of peace, and when is that price too high? Furthermore, understanding the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party is a stark reminder of how democracies can fail. It shows how economic hardship, like the Great Depression, can erode faith in democratic institutions. When people are desperate, they can be swayed by charismatic figures who offer hope but demand unquestioning loyalty and the sacrifice of personal freedoms. It reminds us that democracy is not guaranteed. It must be protected and nurtured. We must be wary of leaders who divide us, who blame minorities for our problems, and who dismiss the rule of law. The warning signs were all there in the 1930s, but not enough people saw them until it was too late. Ultimately, remembering why World War II happened is about honoring the memory of the tens of millions who died. We owe it to them to learn from the mistakes of the past to ensure such a catastrophe never happens again. The world today is not the world of the 1930s, but the same emotions of fear, anger, and nationalism still shape our politics. By studying this dark chapter in our history, we can become more informed citizens, better able to recognize the warning signs of conflict, and better equipped to champion peace, understanding, and cooperation between nations. The past holds the key to a safer future, but only if we have the courage to look at it, learn from it, and remember.